north of Atlanta, deer hunting. I was heading to a WMA in northern Georgia. I only had a short time to scout the area, but I had a basic plan to go early and follow a game trail to where it looked like it crossed a river. My plan was to sit quietly until the early morning deer began to move. I arrived at around 4 a.m. and got my basic gear loaded and began my hike to the trail. I didn't have any lights, except for my headlamp. When I got to where a few trails converged near the river crossing, I looked for cover and found an old rocky foundation of some kind, with stacked rocks and brush providing ample cover. I set up inside the roughly formed area provided by the rock and vegetation. After about 90 minutes, it was legal hunting hours. I continued to wait, but as the day got lighter and brighter, I noticed a lot of things around me. I noticed a yellow tape trampled down on the ground in a few places. The area was very wet and the yellow tape was covered in dirt and mud. It was similar to the tape we used to keep people out of hazard areas and off our trailers when they were in use. I noticed the remnants of paint on the ground. At about 7:45, I hadn't seen a single sign of deer movement, so I decided to move a bit farther into the area. As I got up, I realized I was sitting in what appeared to be a small stone area that was built as a hut or fort or cabin of some type. The ground had a thin slab and the stone was piled up, making walls, some of which were knocked down ages ago, some still in decent shape. I walked up to the road that was about 100 feet from where I was sitting. When I got there, I saw a display of colorful objects. I walked over to the display, and it was a 3-foot tall by 4-foot wide pile of stuffed animals. It had been raining off and on all week, and the toy stuffed animals were all soaking wet, covered in splashed up dirt and mud and looking completely horrible. Affixed to a tree above the stuffed animals was a barely legible sign that was streaking in the rain. It was a memorial for a child that had been murdered in these woods. My mind raced as I realized that the tape on the ground was a police line tape and the paint was likely designating the position of the body. I was completely freaked out. I was kneeling at the exact location of a murder scene, or at least where the body was recovered. Hunting was over for me that day, and I had the shivers randomly for the next several hours. I was walking to my stand early one morning, about an hour before sunup. I started hearing footsteps behind me. I thought I was just being paranoid because, honestly, who hasn't thought they heard scary noises in the dark? But it very quickly became apparent they weren't just echoes or anything like that. I spun around and brought my gun up. My headlight reflected off my scope and I got blinded. I heard the footsteps move off trail, but I couldn't see anything. As I started moving again, a light appeared in the woods to my right, paralleling me about 75 yards away. It continued alongside me for about 50 to 100 yards before I cut my headlight off, at which point it swept back and forth, then clicked off as well. At this point, I crouched down with my gun up and I could hear two male voices whispering to each other. Then silence. I crept to my stand and felt safer with my back to a tree and looking out over the trail I came in on. I never saw any deer. When it was time for lunch, I climbed down the deer stand and checked a rub line maybe 100 yards to my left for activity. When I got back to the stand, there was a dead rabbit at the base. Its head had been neatly cut off and the wound was still steaming. The rabbit was limp, but there was no blood or footprints anywhere nearby. Once, when I was pretty new to hunting, my brother and I were up in this sort of open-ended, horseshoe-shaped canyon up in the mountains hunting elk with bows. We both had radios, so we could talk to each other. Right around the bottom of the horseshoe, the foliage opened up, and I could see my brother right down below me, about 100 yards down in the canyon. I kept an eye on him so I could match his pace. He kept walking forward. Then I saw something exiting the foliage. The same foliage he had just exited. I didn't have binoculars, but I did have my rangefinder, which has a small zoom-in ability. I take it out and look at the thing. It's a cougar, down in a stalking stance following my brother. I get on the radio and tell him not to move, that there's a cougar behind him, and it knows he's there. So he just stops dead in his tracks, doesn't even reply over the radio. It felt like I was watching that thing forever before it turned around and finally left. It's terrifying that those things are so silent. It's so quiet on that mountain, all you hear is footsteps in the snow and maybe a little wind. And my brother still had no idea that it was right behind him. It seems like fun to some people. I used to feel that way myself. It was never for the food, but just sport. And I know this sounds cliche, but I had an experience where the hunter became the hunted. In 2009, I decided to do what I often do. That was take a break and go somewhere to relax. When I heard a hunting expedition was planned, I immediately got on board. There were 2 of my friends on the same trip. I figured it would be fun, and we ended up going with a very veteran hunter named Buck Adams. He told us stories about previous hunting trips where he bagged whatever he was after. Deer, bear, pheasant, he'd gotten them all. He told us we were going to a secret hunting spot in western Pennsylvania, to a place we could find some real trophies. He said he once got a 17-point buck there. Having a chance to grab something of that magnitude made me even more eager. When we arrived at the spot, we were split into groups of 4. There were 13 of us. Buck had his own tent. The other 4 were shared by 3 people each. The first night we were there, he said, "Go ahead and explore before you turn in. Just watch out for the werewolf." I didn't really know how to react, so I just kind of laughed. A guy with us named Mark spoke up and said a creature called the squonk was more believable than that, but Buck's face was stone cold. "I'm not kidding," he said with venom in his voice. When I asked Mark if he was really that confident that there were no werewolves, he gave me the exact reply I was expecting. He just wants to scare us. New kids, old stories, that's the way it works. I was about to reply when we all heard a loud snap. Not knowing what it was and not wanting to know, we all dove inside a tent. I was with Mark, Christopher, and one of my friends. His name was Grant. Chris whispers, "That's 4 people. One of you needs to find a different tent." I wanted to punch him when I heard this weird guttural growl. The four of us did rock, paper, scissors to see who would look out. Grant was the first one to lose. He peeks his head outside, but brought it back in instantly. His eyes were wide, and he seemed too shocked to speak. "What's wrong?" I asked him. He pointed outside, and I looked as well and saw a terrifying sight. There was a monster there, about 8 feet tall. Silver hair, fur, about 8 feet tall. Silver fur and glowing yellow eyes, and a very muscular build. I was about to yell when Mark grabs me from behind and drags me inside the tent and quietly zipped a flap. "Okay," he whispers. Buck wasn't trying to scare us. He was serious. We all huddled together and heard the creature stomping towards our tent. I let out a sigh of fear, and Chris dug his fingers into my arm. Grant started saying Hail Marys, and Mark was letting out squeals of fear. After a few minutes, we all heard a rifle shot. The thing howled like a wolf and ran on 2 legs back into the woods. Buck unzipped our flap and asked if we were okay. We confirmed that we were, but Buck still suggested we go to a different area of the state, so we did the very next morning. Was what we saw on that hunting trip a werewolf? I can't be positive, but it wasn't like a wolf I've ever seen. For one thing, they can't stand on 2 legs, and they aren't 8 feet tall. They don't growl or howl in any way close to what I heard. I decided to just stop camping and hunting altogether after that. Think about it, if there's a werewolf out there, what else could be lurking in the woods?